The hearing was supposed to be Jim Jordan's stage. He had the microphone, the gavel, and the confidence of a man who thrives on interruption and volume. For years, he's built his reputation on shouting down opponents, cutting off witnesses, and throwing out accusations faster than anyone else in the room could respond. It was his style, his weapon, his armor, but this time the script flipped because across from him sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, sharp, precise, unshaken. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She waited. And when the moment came, she struck with devastating precision. Jordan tried to bulldoze his way through the legal arguments. He waved his arms, raised his voice, declared things as fact without the faintest understanding of the law he was citing. He thought the room would bend to his bluster, that another round of shouting would drown out the details. Instead, Crockett leaned in, cut him off, and dismantled him point by point. With every sentence, she revealed what the audience had long suspected. Jordan wasn't debating from strength. He was hiding behind noise, and then came the blow. A single cutting line, simple, factual, undeniable, that stopped Jordan cold. The man who never stops talking froze in his chair, his lips pressed tight, his eyes darting for an escape that didn't exist. The cameras caught it all. The gavel couldn't save him. The shouting couldn't save him. He had been silenced, not by force, not by interruption, but by the brutal exposure of his own ignorance. The clip spread instantly. Crockett ends Jordan trended within minutes. Headlines didn't soften the blow. Jasmine Crockett embarrasses Jim Jordan, live in hearing. Jordan silenced after legal misfire. Crockett schools Jordan on his own stage. It was a moment that turned the tables. Jim Jordan, once feared for his aggression, was humbled in public view. And Jasmine Crockett, calm and relentless, emerged as the sharpest voice in the room. It began like every other hearing where Jim Jordan held the gavel. He sat forward in his chair, sleeves rolled up, his voice already booming before the witness had even finished their introduction. He thrived in this environment, the cameras, the tension, the performative chaos that he knew would translate into viral clips for his base. He wasn't there for detail. He was there for dominance. The room was tense but familiar. Staffers shuffled papers, witnesses adjusted microphones. The buzz of whispered conversations filled the space. And then Jordan slammed down the gavel, leaned into his microphone, and began. He spoke quickly, his words tumbling over each other, his tone sharp and accusatory. He framed the hearing not as a forum for facts, but as a battlefield. He pointed his finger, his voice rising as he laid out accusations designed to grab headlines rather than uncover truth. He didn't pause for rebuttals. He didn't allow for nuance. This was the Jim Jordan performance: speed, volume, and relentless interruption. Across the table, Jasmine Crockett watched quietly. She didn't shuffle her papers. She didn't glance around nervously. She listened, her expression calm, her body still, her hands folded on the desk. Her eyes tracked Jordan's every word, waiting for the moment when she would get her turn. Jordan rattled off legal claims with the confidence of someone who believed volume could replace precision. He tossed out phrases like constitutional overreach and legal misconduct, stringing together buzzwords that sounded powerful but collapsed under scrutiny. He waved documents in the air without context, his voice growing louder with every sentence. "This is clear," he barked, slamming his hand on the table for emphasis. "This is a blatant violation, and everyone in this room knows it." But the problem was obvious. Jordan's statements didn't match the facts. His arguments weren't grounded in law. They were stitched together from half-read talking points and out-of-context sound bites. And Crockett knew it. When Jordan finally paused, not because he was finished, but because his voice had pushed itself to the edge, he leaned back with the air of a man who thought he had just scored. He smirked slightly, scanning the room, daring anyone to challenge him. That was the opening Jasmine Crockett had been waiting for. She leaned forward slowly, her voice calm, steady, and piercingly clear. "Mr. Jordan, with all due respect, what you just laid out isn't law. It's noise." The room shifted instantly. Staffers looked up. Cameras zoomed closer. The contrast was immediate. Jordan's bluster against Crockett's precision. She picked up the stack of papers in front of her, flipping calmly to a marked page. "You've just cited constitutional authority that doesn't exist. You've misstated precedent, and you've ignored the most basic principle that every first-year law student understands: Jordan's face tightened. His smirk faltered. He leaned back toward his microphone, ready to cut her off, but Crockett didn't yield. Her voice grew sharper, her pace quicker, as she laid out exactly where he had gone wrong. You keep using the phrase constitutional violation. Let me be clear. You haven't cited a single clause, a single ruling, or a single statute that supports what you're saying. You're stringing words together, hoping they'll sound authoritative. But anyone with legal training can see through it. The silence in the room was deafening. Jordan's mouth opened slightly, his body leaning forward as if to interrupt, but Crockett's words kept coming, each one sharper than the last. And that's the difference here. You rely on shouting. I rely on law. You rely on noise. I rely on facts. Jordan froze. The cameras caught the moment, his eyes narrowing, his lips pressed tight, his body shifting restlessly in his chair. For once, the man who prided himself on cutting off everyone else had been cut off himself, not with volume, but with undeniable clarity. The setup was complete. The trap had been sprung. Jim Jordan, who walked into the hearing ready to dominate, had just been exposed as unprepared, uninformed, and completely outmatched, and Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. Jim Jordan's smirk had already faltered once. Crockett's words, crisp, calm, surgical, had cut through his noise like a scalpel through fabric. For a man who built his persona on interruptions, on controlling the tempo with volume, the sudden quiet that followed was disorienting. But Jordan was not one to yield easily. He leaned forward again, his sleeves already rolled up as if he were heading into a wrestling match rather than a congressional hearing. His voice came quick, sharp, and loud, bouncing off the walls of the chamber. With all due respect. Representative Crockett, he said, his tone loaded with sarcasm, you can lecture all you want, but the facts are clear. The Constitution doesn't allow this kind of overreach. It's right there. Plain as day. He slapped his palm onto the desk, the sound echoing through the microphone. His eyes darted around the room, looking for affirmation, scanning for nods. It was his old trick, speak with absolute certainty, repeat the words enough times, and hope the room confuses confidence with competence. Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned forward too, matching his posture but not his volume. Her voice was lower, quieter even, but infinitely sharper. Mr. Jordan, point me to the clause, right now. You say it's plain as day. Show me. The room froze. Staffers looked up. Members shifted in their seats. The challenge was direct, undeniable, and inescapable. Jordan blinked. He shuffled his papers, flipping through notes that were more talking points than text. It's right there, he stammered, his voice faltering for the first time. Article 2? Executive overreach. Everybody knows this. Crockett raised an eyebrow, her eyes narrowing as if she were examining a flawed argument under a microscope. Article 2 outlines the powers of the executive. It does not say what you just claimed. Not anywhere. You are either misquoting it deliberately or you simply don't understand it. Which one is it, Mr. Jordan? A ripple ran through the room. The air grew heavier. Jordan's face flushed slightly. He opened his mouth, ready to fire back, but Crockett didn't let the silence stretch long enough for him to fill it with noise. She continued, flipping to her own marked document. Here's Article 2, she said, reading aloud. Here's what it actually says, and here's how it has been interpreted in precedent after precedent. None of which support your statement. None. Her words landed with the finality of a gavel. Jordan shifted in his chair, his hand drumming nervously against the table. He tried to interject. Well, that's your interpretation, Crockett's eyes flashed. Her voice cut across him like steel. No, Mr. Jordan, that's the law. There's a difference. The silence after that line was electric. Even the cameras seemed to lean in closer. Jordan's strategy, dominate, interrupt, overwhelm, was unraveling in real time. He raised his voice again, louder this time, trying to reassert himself. I'm telling you, this is wrong. Everyone knows it's wrong. The Constitution is on our side. Crockett leaned back slightly, folding her arms. Her voice was calm, almost casual, but dripping with authority. If the Constitution is on your side, you should be able to cite it. You can't, and that silence, Mr. Jordan, says more than your shouting ever could. The first clash was over, and it wasn't close. Jordan wasn't used to being cornered. He thrived on chaos, on rapid fire, on overwhelming his opponents until the sound of his voice drowned them out. But Crockett was unshaken, Every time he raised his voice, she lowered hers. Every time he blustered, she delivered facts. The contrast was brutal. He leaned forward again, jabbing a finger toward her across the table. You want me to cite precedent? Fine, how about Youngstown v. Sawyer? Everyone knows that case proves the executive can't act outside of congressional authority. He sat back, smug, convinced he had landed a blow. He pronounced the case name as if it were a knockout punch, but Crockett smiled slightly, the kind of smile you give when your opponent has just walked into the trap you set for them. She flipped another page in her binder and nodded. Excellent. Let's talk about Youngstown versus Sawyer. Do you know what year that was decided, Mr. Jordan? Jordan blinked. His lips parted, but no sound came immediately. He hesitated, then muttered, 1952. Correct, Crockett said, her tone smooth. Now, do you know what the court actually held in that case? Jordan's confidence returned briefly. Yes, that the president couldn't seize the steel mills. It limited executive power, Crockett's eyes sharpened. No, it clarified the scope of executive power in relation to congressional authority. And more importantly, it created the framework we still use today to analyze those powers. That framework, which you clearly haven't read, undermines the very argument you're trying to make. You are citing a case that proves you wrong. The silence was crushing. Jordan's mouth twitched, his face reddening further. He tried to speak, but Crockett didn't give him room. You see, this is the problem, she continued, her voice steady. You throw out names of cases you've half read, thinking they'll intimidate people into silence. But when pressed, you don't know the holdings. You don't know the reasoning. You don't even understand the implications. What you just did is not legal argument. It's theater, the room erupted in murmurs. Staffers scribbled notes furiously. Some members leaned back in their chairs, shaking their heads, the spectacle too clear to ignore. Jordan leaned in, his voice nearly shouting now. That's not true! That's not true! You're twisting it, Crockett cut him off cleanly. No, Mr. Jordan, that's the law. And every time you open your mouth, you prove you don't know it. Jordan sat back, visibly rattled now. He tugged at his sleeve, his hand fidgeting with the microphone. His usual confidence, the booming certainty that carried him through hearings, was gone. His voice wavered, not with humility, but with desperation. This is ridiculous, he muttered. You're making it personal. Crockett shook her head slowly. Her voice dropped lower, but her words carried even more weight. This isn't personal. This is professional. And the profession is law. Something you clearly haven't studied as deeply as you pretend. Jordan's eyes darted to the chair beside him, then back to the desk in front of him. He tried one more time to raise his voice, to reclaim control. You don't get it! You're missing the bigger picture! But the bigger picture was already clear. To the room, to the cameras, to the viewers at home. Jim Jordan had been exposed, his ignorance laid bare, his bluster stripped of its power. Jasmine Crockett sat still, composed, in control of the moment. Every rebuttal had landed. Every fact had hit its mark. The escalation was over, and Jordan wasn't on top. He was unraveling. The silence that followed was louder than his shouting, and the silencing blow, the one that would leave him frozen in his chair, humiliated in front of millions, was still to come. Jim Jordan had tried every weapon in his arsenal. He had raised his voice. He had slammed his hand on the desk. He had thrown around legal jargon like confetti, hoping that volume and repetition would mask the cracks in his arguments. But none of it had worked. Jasmine Crockett had dismantled every point calmly, surgically, with the precision of someone who actually knew the law inside and out. The room could feel it. The rhythm was different now. Jordan's voice, once the loudest in the chamber, now sounded strained, defensive. Crockett's, steady and unyielding, cut through like steel. Jordan made one last attempt to seize control. He leaned into his microphone, his face flushed, his voice pitched higher than before. The bottom line here, he barked, is that this administration is acting unconstitutionally, and it's my job to call it out. He sat back quickly, nodding to himself as though he'd landed a knockout punch. He looked around the room, scanning for agreement, waiting for the familiar murmurs of support. But there was none. The silence hung heavy, broken only by the faint shuffle of papers and the soft buzz of the cameras. Crockett leaned forward slowly, her eyes fixed on him. She spoke with deliberate calm, her voice lower than his but infinitely sharper. Mr. Jordan, you keep using that word, unconstitutional. But you haven't cited a clause. You haven't cited a statute. You haven't cited a ruling. You've shouted, you've gestured, you've waved papers in the air, but you haven't cited the law. Do you know why? Jordan blinked. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. He shifted in his chair, his hand tapping against the desk, his usual rhythm broken. Crockett didn't wait for him to stumble through an answer. She pressed on, because you don't know it, because you haven't studied it, because for you this isn't about law. It's about theater. You think the louder you shout, the more correct you are. But that's not how law works. That's not how the Constitution works. And that's not how Congress works. Jordan opened his mouth again, his voice faltering as he tried to push back. That's not true. Crockett cut across him with surgical precision. Name the clause, Mr. Jordan, right now. Name it. The room went silent. Every head turned toward Jordan. The cameras zoomed closer, capturing his face as his eyes darted downward, his hands fumbling through his papers, flipping pages he hadn't read. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again, but nothing came out. Crockett sat perfectly still, watching. Her voice dropped even lower, almost a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. You can't, and that silence says everything. Jordan froze. His jaw clenched, his face flushed deep red, his eyes blinking rapidly. He adjusted his microphone, tugged at his sleeve, glanced around the room, anything to avoid meeting Crockett's gaze. The cameras caught it all. The man who never stopped talking, silenced by the very ignorance he thought he could hide behind. The blow had landed. Jim Jordan, silenced live, exposed in front of the nation. The silence didn't end when the gavel struck. It carried into the halls, into the headlines, onto the screens of millions of viewers who replayed the moment again and again. Jim Jordan, the man who prided himself on volume, had been silenced by precision. Within minutes, the clip was online. Name the clause, Mr. Jordan, right now. Name it. Jasmine Crockett's line spread across Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, edited and looped with Jordan's stunned silence. Viewers zoomed in on his face, replayed his fumbling hands, highlighted the awkward shuffle of papers that betrayed his unpreparedness. Memes appeared almost instantly. Images of Jordan with blank speech bubbles, captions reading, "Still waiting," or "Name it." TikTok users remixed the clip with dramatic music, slow-motion zooms, and flashing text. Silenced. News outlets pounced. By the evening, the headlines were, "Everywhere, Jasmine Crockett schools Jim. Jordan on constitutional law. Jordan, left speechless after legal challenge. Crockett turns Jordan's bluster into silence," commentators praised. Crockett's calm authority, contrasting it with Jordan's theatrics. One columnist wrote, "Jordan came armed with noise. Crockett came armed with knowledge." And in that clash, knowledge won. Inside Congress, the whispers grew louder. Staffers traded the clip. Lawmakers commented quietly in hallways, some with smirks, others with outright laughter. For years, Jordan had dominated hearings with his aggressive style, cutting off opponents, controlling the tempo. But this time, he had been checked. And not just checked, humbled. Back in his office, Jordan was reportedly livid. Staffers described him pacing, muttering about unfair treatment, insisting he had been ambushed. But no amount of spin could erase the footage. The cameras didn't lie. His silence was there for the world to see. Meanwhile, Crockett's phone buzzed nonstop. Messages from colleagues, friends, even strangers flooded in. Some congratulated her on her composure. Others called her a hero. Social media crowned her the winner of the day, praising not just her sharpness, but her ability to cut through the noise with surgical clarity. Late-night hosts seized the moment. Clips of Jordan's silence aired alongside jokes about the loudest man in Congress, finally out of words. Satirists mocked his fumbling, comparing it to a student who hadn't done the reading but tried to bluff their way through class. The aftermath was brutal. Jordan's brand had always been control through chaos. But after this exchange, the chaos looked hollow. The silence spoke louder than his shouts. As the days passed, the clip refused to die. It resurfaced in news debates, in think pieces, in highlight reels of congressional clashes. Each time it replayed, the narrative grew stronger. Jasmine Crockett had silenced Jim Jordan, and nothing he said afterward could erase that image. For Jordan, the legacy was painful. His reputation as the loudest, most aggressive voice in hearings had been punctured. The moment he couldn't name the clause became shorthand for his bluster. Every time he tried to dominate a witness or bulldoze a colleague, people remembered the silence. They remembered the shuffle of papers, the flushed face, the fumbling. For Crockett, the legacy was transformative. Overnight, she became a national figure, the representative who had stood her ground, exposed ignorance, and done it without theatrics. Commentators praised her as a rising star, someone who brought substance into a room too often dominated by sound bites. The quote itself, "Name the clause," right now, became iconic. It was printed on T-shirts, repeated in interviews, turned into hashtags. It became a catchphrase for accountability, a reminder that facts matter more than volume. Even months later, when Jordan appeared in other hearings, the echoes followed him. Colleagues smirked when he shouted. Viewers online flooded comment sections with the same line. Name the clause. Jim. The moment stuck, not because Crockett had embarrassed him with flair, but because she had exposed him with truth. And that was the final irony. Jim Jordan had spent years turning hearings into performances, chasing viral clips with his volume. But the clip that defined him wasn't one of his rants. It was his silence. The legacy of that day wasn't just the destruction of Jordan's argument. It was the reminder that in the halls of power, noise isn't strength. Knowledge is, and Jasmine Crockett proved it. Live, on camera, with one devastating blow that silenced the loudest man in the room.